Hey BookTube, I have a ShakeTube 2020 update for you. For those of you who are unfamiliar, ShakeTube is a reading event that is happening in September, and it is hosted by several different booktubers: Steve Donahue, Lukash at Totally Pretentious, Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse, and Rainy Day Reads. And throughout the month of September, the hosts are reading various plays, and then at the last week of September, they are doing a group read of Hamlet. So you can go check out their channels every weekend to see them discuss the various plays that they have decided to read over the course of this month. And a few days ago, I had made a video talking about my Shakespeare TBR for this particular event. And I said how I was going to read The Winter's Tale by Shakespeare, and then also the retelling modern adaptation of it by Jeannette Winterson called The Gap of Time. And I have a long weekend this weekend because it's Labor Day here in the United States. And so I have managed to read both of these this weekend in like less than 2 days. And so I wanted to give you an update before I lose what I want to say about these while my memory is still fresh. And so I wanted to talk about these in this video today. So before I get into talking about what The Winter's Tale is about, I just want to say I read it in this Everyman Shakespeare edition that I got from my local library, and I really, really like these editions. They have the text of the play on one side of the page, and then on the other side are the notes that go along with the text. And it just makes for a really easy reading experience, and I felt like the language that is used in this is also easier to understand than in some of the other editions of Shakespeare that I've tried to read. I have a couple different anthologies, and I just find those to be so cumbersome, and sometimes I get lost in the notes and the text, and this was just a much easier, cleaner reading experience for me. I highly recommend these Everyman Shakespeare editions because I feel like they're doing it right. They make it easy to read these, especially if you're someone who isn't necessarily as comfortable with Shakespeare's writing as someone who, you know, has more experience and whatnot with Shakespeare. So I highly recommend these editions because I think they're wonderful. My library actually has a couple more of his plays in this edition, and I might, at some point, maybe not in September, but at some point check them out and read them. Because, like I said, this just was very accessible for me, especially as someone who feels like I'm not always competent at understanding Shakespeare's plays. This Everyman Shakespeare edition made that so much easier. Anyway, so a little bit of historical background. The Winter's Tale is one of Shakespeare's comedies, and it was first performed around 1611, and the starting point of this play is sexual jealousy between Leontes and his friend Polixenes. Leontes is the king of Sicilia, and then his friend Polixenes is king of Bohemia, and I'm sure I'm butchering those names, I apologize. But anyway, they are visiting Bohemia. And during that time, Leontes thinks that his wife, Hermione, is having an affair with the king of Bohemia, right? And he's trying to convince others of this. And they're like, no, this isn't true. And his wife, Hermione, has a maid who, her name is Pauline. And she is trying to convince him that, no, this is not true, they're not having an affair, and he won't listen to anyone. And so he ends up sort of taking refuge in revenge and fantasy and then self-imposed isolation because he can't convince anyone that his wife has not had an affair with the king of Bohemia. Meanwhile, his wife is pregnant with a child that ends up being a girl, and Leontes is convinced that the child is not his. He thinks it is the child of his wife's affair with the king of Bohemia. And so when his wife gives birth to this child, he wants the child whose name ends up being Perdita taken away and left out in like a forest somewhere, and left to whatever fate awaits her. He wants to get rid of her. He doesn't want this so-called reminder of his wife's supposed affair, right? So he has one of his men take the baby Perdita into the forest and leave her there to whatever fate may befall her. Well, Perdita is rescued by Antigonus from being bear food, and he actually loses his life to the bear by saving the baby. And Antigonus is also a lord of Sicilia. Anyway, so Perdita then is taken into another family, and 16 years go by. Hermione disappears from the picture, and Leontes is repentant, supposedly, of what has happened with his wife and his daughter, and so we get to part 2 of the play, and if part 1 is a tragedy, then part 2 is the comedy part of the play. You have these like dances and entertainment type things going on. There's clowns and there's singers and all of these entertainment things happening, right? Anyway, and so Leontes has also had a statue made of Hermione and his wife, and while they are at, I can't remember where he's at, but anyway, while he is at one of these festivals, he ends up being reunited with his daughter because she is engaged to one of Leontes's like boyhood nemesis type people. Anyway, and so he ends up being reunited with Perdita after 16 years. And when this happens, then they're going to have like a marriage for Perdita and this guy. And the statue of Hermione awakens and speaks to her daughter. And I read in the introduction of this that, I don't remember who the introduction was written by. Let me see. I guess it's not really the introduction, it's a foreword. It was written by Adrian Noble, who was the artistic director of the Royal Shakespeare Company. Anyway, he wrote that the awakening of the Hermione statue has the same power of confirmation as confirmation of faith. Right? So like taking the blood and body of Christ is very similar to the Hermione statue awakening. Because Paulina, who was the maid of Hermione, has believed in God's words, and so she's kind of the person behind the statue, and Hermione becoming alive, so to speak, right? So this story is really about Leontes being given a second chance with his daughter, and then also it's the story, of course, of Perdita and what happens to her when she is abandoned by her family, right? So that is The Winter's Tale, the actual play itself, what happens. And then, like I said, I also read The Gap of Time, which is Jeannette Winterson's retelling of it in modern times. And in this retelling, Leontes is called Leo, and he is a very wealthy businessman, tech guy, who is in business with his friend, who is called Zeno in this. And of course, he thinks that Zeno and his wife are having an affair, and there's lots of money involved, and then of course he asks his gardener, Leo asks his gardener to take his wife's baby and take her to Zeno because he thinks Zeno is the father, right? And then when the gardener takes the baby to New Bohemia, as it's called, he can't get a hold of Zeno. And he ends up being chased by these men who are after the money that Leo had put with the baby. So the gardener puts Perdita in a baby hatch at a hospital, which is where you could leave like babies you didn't want without any punishment. Anyway, he does that, and she ends up being found by a black man named Shep and his son Chloe. And so the story goes on from there, where it ends up that eventually, through various circumstances, Perdita is reunited with both Zeno and Leo. And this all takes place between England, which is just like typical England, and then a city in the United States called New Bohemia, right? Because that's where Shep and Chloe and Perdita and also Zeno all live. And then Leo is in England. So I really enjoyed the retelling of The Winter's Tale. There were parts of this that were pretty graphic. At one point, Leo tries to kill Zeno, and he also puts a camera in their bedroom at home, Leo and Hermione's bedroom, because he wants to catch Zeno and his wife having the affair, and he's watching this camera when Zeno, his wife, Zeno, Hermione, and Paulina, the secretary for Leo, are all at Leo's house, and he keeps imagining what they're gonna do, right? And he gets very graphic about it, but none of it actually ever happens because they're not having an affair. So yeah, this was, like I said, really good. I'm really glad I finally read this because it's been sitting on my shelves for ages. I would highly recommend reading this if you're interested in a retelling of The Winter's Tale, because, like I said, it is fabulous. And it's also less than 300 pages. I think it's like 250 or something. It's a fast read because there's not a lot of text on the page. So yeah, I read this, like I said, in less than 2 days, really. It was more like a day. And so, yeah, I feel like Jeannette Winterson did a fabulous job with this retelling, putting it into modern circumstances, and still keeping to something of the original story. And also, Jeannette Winterson is just a fantastic writer anyway. I've liked other stuff that she's written, so I'm not surprised that I like this so well. So, those were my two of my reads for ShakeTube 2020. I started earlier this afternoon my nonfiction read that I'm going to do for ShakeTube, which is Will of the World, How Shakespeare Became Shakespeare by Stephen Greenblatt. I read the first chapter of that earlier this afternoon. I don't know if I'll read any other plays by Shakespeare or any retellings. I have a couple other retellings that I could read, but I don't know if I will or not, because I have several other books I want to read this month, especially considering that in October I want to participate in Victober, and so I kind of want to finish up some other odds and ends I have going before that begins. But anyway, highly recommend both of these if you haven't read them already, and if you have read The Winter's Tale, or if you've read The Gap of Time, and if you've read both, let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and I will talk to you again soon. Thanks, BookTube.